Spring 1943, a train pulls into Huntsville, Texas. Armed guards stand ready as the doors slide open. Then, something unexpected. The sound of singing, four-part harmony. German military songs echoing across the platform. 3,000 townspeople have gathered to watch. They've come to see the enemy, members of Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps, captured in North Africa and shipped halfway around the world to the heart of Texas. The prisoners marched 3 miles from the station to Camp Huntsville, still singing, their voices carrying across fields of cotton and corn. What happens next is one of World War II's most remarkable untold stories. Over the next 3 years, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, mostly German, would live and work in over 500 camps across America. They would pick cotton alongside Texas farmers. They would eat Sunday dinner with Kansas families. They would fall in love with American women and argue politics with American guards. Many Americans at home would call it scandalous. In December 1941, when America entered World War II, the idea of hosting enemy prisoners on U.S. soil was barely a consideration. The nation had never dealt with large numbers of foreign POWs. There was no infrastructure, no experience, no plan. Then came North Africa. In May 1943, after months of brutal desert warfare, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, Germany's elite armored division, surrendered to Allied forces. Over 150,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners virtually overnight. Britain couldn't house them. Food was scarce, space scarcer. The logistics of guarding and feeding that many prisoners while fighting a war across multiple continents was untenable. So the British asked America, "Can you take them?" The request created immediate problems. The U.S. military lacked the personnel to guard hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Most soldiers fluent in German or Italian were fighting overseas. Security concerns were enormous. What if the prisoners escaped? What if they sabotaged war production? And how would American citizens react to the sight of enemy soldiers walking their streets? But there were compelling reasons to say yes. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which Germany had signed, required humane treatment of POWs. How America treated German prisoners would directly affect how Germany treated the nearly 94,000 American soldiers in German captivity. Reciprocity wasn't just a legal obligation, it was a moral imperative. And there was another factor, one that would prove decisive. America needed workers. By 1943, 12 million American men had left for war. Farms across the country were desperate for labor. Factories needed hands. Construction projects sat unfinished. The first challenge was where to put them. Security demanded isolation from strategic targets on the coasts. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoners should be housed in climates similar to where they were captured, and practical necessity required proximity to the farms and industries that needed their labor. The answer was America's heartland. In Texas, construction crews worked through the spring and summer of 1943, building what locals would soon call Fritz Ritz, prisoner camps that some Americans thought were too comfortable for the enemy. Camp Huntsville took nearly a year to build. 837 acres, over 400 buildings, capacity for 4,800 prisoners. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mexia. Across the state, massive compounds rose from empty land. The architecture was standardized, 9 to 10-foot barbed wire fences, sometimes double or triple layered, guard towers with searchlights scanning the perimeter at night. A standard compound contained 20 barracks, each housing 50 men, 4 kitchens with mess halls, laundry facilities, officer quarters, recreation areas. From the outside, they looked like prisons, because they were prisons. But inside, something more complicated was taking shape. The barracks were basic but functional. Bunk beds, pot-bellied stoves for heat,
Electric lights, a luxury many German soldiers hadn't known even in their own military. The camps had infirmaries with actual doctors and medicine. Canteens where prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even beer with the wages they earned. The Geneva Convention was a blueprint for everything. It mandated adequate shelter, sufficient food, medical care, and the opportunity for productive work. Officers couldn't be forced to labor, though enlisted men could be assigned tasks unrelated to direct war production. Camp commanders took these requirements seriously, not just out of legal obligation, but strategic calculation. The better America treated German prisoners, the better Germany might treat American prisoners. Every meal served, every medical treatment provided was a message sent.
The first challenge was where to put them. Security demanded isolation from strategic targets on the coasts. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoners should be housed in climates similar to where they were captured, and practical necessity required proximity to the farms and industries that needed their labor. The answer was America's heartland. In Texas, construction crews worked through the spring and summer of 1943, building what locals would soon call Fritz Ritz, prisoner camps that some Americans thought were too comfortable for the enemy. Camp Huntsville took nearly a year to build, 837 acres, over 400 buildings, capacity for 4,800 prisoners. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mexia. Across the state, massive compounds rose from empty land. The architecture was standardized, 9 to 10-foot barbed wire fences, sometimes double or triple layered, guard towers with searchlights scanning the perimeter at night. A standard compound contained 20 barracks, each housing 50 men, 4 kitchens with mess halls, laundry facilities, officer quarters, recreation areas. From the outside, they looked like prisons, because they were prisons. But inside, something more complicated was taking shape. The barracks were basic but functional. Bunk beds, pot-bellied stoves for heat, electric lights, a luxury many German soldiers hadn't known even in their own military. The camps had infirmaries with actual doctors and medicine, canteens where prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, even beer with the wages they earned. The Geneva Convention was the blueprint for everything. It mandated adequate shelter, sufficient food, medical care, and the opportunity for productive work. Officers couldn't be forced to labor, though enlisted men could be assigned tasks unrelated to direct war production. Camp commanders took these requirements seriously, not just out of legal obligation but strategic calculation. The better America treated German prisoners, the better Germany might treat American prisoners. Every meal served, every medical treatment provided, was a message sent across the Atlantic. But compliance with international law doesn't fully explain what happened in these camps, because the reality of daily life often exceeded minimum requirements. And that reality would fundamentally change how many German prisoners saw America and themselves. For many German prisoners, especially those who'd grown up during the Nazi rise to power, America was a revelation that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Their propaganda had portrayed Americans as weak, decadent, divided by race and class, a mongrel nation without the discipline and purity of the Third Reich. Reality told a different story. They witnessed American abundance firsthand. The meals they ate every day were better than what German civilians were surviving on. The waste they saw, food thrown away, resources casually discarded, was incomprehensible to men from a nation where everything was rationed and reused. They saw American soldiers debating politics, criticizing their own government, questioning orders,
In Nazi Germany, such dissent would mean death. Here, it was Tuesday afternoon conversation. They saw women working in positions of authority, not just as nurses or secretaries, but as mechanics, factory supervisors, administrators. They saw black soldiers in uniform guarding white prisoners, a reversal that bewildered men raised on notions of racial hierarchy. The diversity itself was shocking. German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American farmers, Japanese-American citizens in states outside the internment zone, and immigrants from dozens of nations. America wasn't one thing, it was many things, somehow functioning together. Don Kerr, who delivered milk to a Kansas POW camp, later remembered, "I talked to several of them. I thought they were very nice." That simple interaction, enemy prisoners being very nice to American civilians, happened thousands of times across the country. Tom Bucher, curator of the Fort Robinson Museum, explained, "People thought of the POWs as Nazis, but half of the prisoners had no inclination to sympathize with the Nazi Party. Fewer than 10% were hardcore ideologues. The rest were soldiers who'd been drafted, who'd fought because their nation told them to, who'd believed the propaganda until reality contradicted it. And reality was contradicting it."
Not everyone was happy about the situation. The U.S. government received hundreds of letters every week from citizens demanding that German prisoners be executed immediately. Many Americans, reading casualty lists in their newspapers, couldn't understand why the enemy was being fed 3 meals a day and paid wages while their sons died overseas. The complaints weren't entirely without merit. Americans at home faced strict rationing: meat, sugar, coffee, gasoline, rubber. Meanwhile, POW camps had steady supplies of name-brand cigarettes, Coca-Cola, and other items American civilians couldn't get. One Arkansas resident recalled July 4, 1944. "I had a couple of nickels and wanted to buy a Coke. There were none to be found. We were told that all were taken to the Germans that week." The Fritz Ritz nickname wasn't just sarcasm, it was anger. Many communities genuinely believed the prisoners were being coddled while Americans sacrificed. Labor unions opposed the POW work program, arguing that prisoners were taking jobs from American workers or undermining wage standards. The government tried to explain that the Geneva Convention required humane treatment, that treating German prisoners well made it more likely Germany would treat American prisoners well in return. But that logic didn't satisfy everyone. There were other tensions too. In some communities, young women were attracted to the prisoners. Handsome, often educated men who spoke exotic languages and represented a kind of forbidden romance. Some prisoners did escape briefly, usually to pursue romantic relationships. Love letters between German POWs and American women exist in archives, evidence of connections that crossed enemy lines. Security incidents were rare but real. Of the 425,000 prisoners, 2,222 attempted escape, less than 1%. Most were recaptured within a day. Only 7 German prisoners were unaccounted for at repatriation. Gord Gartner escaped from Camp Deeming, New Mexico in September 1945 and remained free until 1985, 40 years living under assumed identities in America rather than return to Soviet-occupied Silesia. And there were darker moments. At least one recorded incident exists of U.S. authorities using torture to extract information from German POWs, though such cases were exceptional rather than systemic. Several prisoners died in camps, some from illness, some from accidents, some from violence between prisoners themselves as Nazi loyalists attacked those they saw as traitors. Today, 860 German POWs remain buried in 43 sites across the United States, their graves often tended by local German-American communities. They died far from home, casualties not of combat, but of the strange limbo of captivity. But these controversies, real as they were, existed within a larger framework. America had chosen to follow its own laws even when doing so was unpopular. It had decided that maintaining moral standards mattered even toward enemies, even in total war. That choice would have consequences that extended.
In late 1944, as Allied victory became inevitable, American authorities launched something unprecedented: a systematic program to re-educate German POWs about democracy. Fort Eustis in Virginia became the center of this effort. Over 26,000 German prisoners went through a 6-day course covering 12 topics: U.S. history, geography, government structure, the benefits of democracy and capitalism, and, most controversially, the reality of Nazi atrocities. The hardest sessions forced prisoners to watch newsreel footage of concentration camp liberations: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Mountains of corpses, living skeletons, the systematic machinery of genocide laid bare. Reactions varied. Some prisoners hung their heads or covered their eyes. Others insisted the Americans had faked the films, that such horrors couldn't be real, couldn't have been done in Germany's name. A few smiled through the footage, unfeeling, their ideology intact despite evidence. But many, perhaps most, were genuinely shocked. Not all German soldiers were Nazis. Not all Germans knew what had been done in the camps. For these men, the footage was a revelation that shattered their understanding of what they'd fought for. The re-education program wasn't purely about Nazi ideology. It taught English. It explained American governance, how Congress worked, how presidents were elected, how citizens could criticize their leaders without being imprisoned. It demonstrated, through daily example, how a free society functioned. For men who'd grown up in totalitarian Germany, these weren't abstract concepts. They were observable realities demonstrated every day in how guards acted, how administrators made decisions, how even prisoners had certain rights that couldn't be arbitrarily violated. The program's effectiveness is difficult to measure, but post-war evidence suggests it had impact. Werner Funke, who corresponded with 80 fellow prisoners after repatriation, reported that no re-education had been necessary. They had become convinced Democrats simply through their treatment in American camps. After the war, approximately 5,000 former German POWs emigrated to the United States. Thousands more returned for visits. Some became prominent in post-war West Germany, carrying with them memories of American democracy in action. Rüdiger von Weckmar lived in New York for 14 years as. Beginning in November 1945, repatriation began at a rate of 50,000 prisoners per month, but the return wasn't straightforward. Many prisoners didn't want to go back. Germany was devastated, cities in ruins, food scarce, millions displaced. The Germany they'd left no longer existed. For men who'd spent years in American camps eating well and working for wages, the prospect of returning to post-war devastation was grim. And politically, the situation was complex. General Lucius Clay, overseeing American occupation of Germany, didn't want 400,000 healthy German men flooding back into a destroyed nation where feeding them would strain Allied resources. American farmers didn't want to lose their labor force, but labor unions demanded the prisoners leave to free up jobs for returning American soldiers. President Truman settled it with characteristic bluntness: ship them out. Most German POWs spent the next 2 to 3 years in France or Britain helping repair war damage before finally returning to Germany. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German prisoners, treated relatively well by Americans, were now put to hard labor by the nations they'd occupied and brutalized. When they finally returned to Germany, many not until 1947 or 1948, they found a country transformed, divided, occupied, beginning the long, painful process of confronting what had been done in its name. The relationships formed during captivity didn't all end at repatriation. Farmers maintained correspondence with prisoners who'd worked their land. Some American families sent food and clothing to Germany during the desperate post-war years. Reunions happened. Former POWs returning to visit the communities where they'd been imprisoned, renewing friendships with former guards and farmers.
The Luton family of Kansas established a lively letter exchange with their POW farmhands and eventually visited them in Germany. Similar stories played out across America, strange friendships that crossed enemy lines and outlasted the war itself. One Kansas farmer recalled a prisoner telling him, "I liked it here because no one was shooting at me." That simple statement captures something profound. For many prisoners, American captivity had been the
Today, most of the POW camps are gone. Camp Huntsville became part of Sam Houston State University and eventually a golf course. Camp Mexia became a state school. Camp Swift was divided into housing developments and a prison. Only Camp Hearn maintains partially reconstructed quarters and offers guided tours, a living museum of this forgotten chapter. The barracks have been demolished, the guard towers torn down, the barbed wire removed. In their place, college campuses, industrial parks, farmland that shows no trace of the thousands who once lived and worked there. But the legacy persists in less visible ways. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government, not Germans themselves, for the war. That distinction between a nation and its ideology, between individual soldiers and the regime they served, made possible the relatively humane treatment prisoners received. And that treatment, in turn, had consequences. The Associated Press later called the POW camps an all but forgotten part of history. Yet many former prisoners went on to become prominent in post-war West Germany, bringing with them first-hand experience of American democracy. They'd seen how a free society functioned. They'd witnessed prosperity that didn't require conquest. They'd experienced tolerance, debate, and the messy vitality of democratic life. When Germany needed to rebuild itself as a democracy, these men had models to draw from, not theoretical abstractions, but lived experiences. The story of German POWs in America reveals something essential about how democracies fight wars. They face constant tension between security and principle, between military necessity and moral standards, between the demands of total war and the requirements of their own values. America didn't always resolve those tensions perfectly. Japanese American citizens were imprisoned while German POWs were treated relatively well, a stark contrast that reveals the nation's racial prejudices. Security incidents happened, mistakes were made, some camps were better than others. But the larger pattern holds. America chose to follow its own laws even when doing so was difficult. It maintained Geneva Convention standards even when its citizens demanded harsher treatment. It provided not just minimum requirements, but often exceeded them because doing so aligned with how the nation understood itself. That self-understanding wasn't just propaganda. The guards who taught prisoners English, the farmers who invited POWs to family dinners, the Red Cross volunteers who
In the end, 425,000 German prisoners spent years in American camps. They picked cotton in Texas and potatoes in Idaho. They sang songs in four-part harmony and argued politics with their guards. They learned English and taught origami to American children. They fell in love with American women and wrote letters home describing a nation that bore no resemblance to their propaganda. Most returned to Germany changed in ways they couldn't fully articulate. They'd seen abundance without conquest, democracy without chaos, strength without cruelty. The experience didn't erase the war's trauma or Germany's crimes, but it provided a counter-narrative to everything they'd been taught. The camps themselves are gone now. Only memories remain, stored in archives and aging letters, in the stories passed down by guards' grandchildren and prisoners' descendants, in the 860 graves scattered across America where German soldiers lie buried far from home. This is what democracies do, even imperfectly. They create spaces where humanity can persist amid brutality. They maintain standards even under pressure. They choose again and again to honor their own principles even when enemies wouldn't extend the same courtesy. The lesson isn't simple patriotic pride, it's more complex and more valuable, that how we treat those we have power over defines us more clearly than any victory speech.